Well, we thought we might get underway. Thank you very much for staying. We wish that we had something extra to give you, perhaps if we'd bribed people or something. Anyhow, my name is Patrick Quirk. I'm an assistant professor at Bond University Law School in Australia. This is Professor Fischer, who is an assistant professor at Catholic, and we're going to tell you today about a project that we did collaboratively over the web between two classes that we were teaching simultaneously. My class was called The Law of Electronic Commerce, which has been running for a few years now at Bond, and Susanna's course was Cyber Law, which I've since taught at Catholic. I apologise for not having an American accent. I've tried hard to pick one up in these last 6 months, but it hasn't worked, except when I'm in a retail context when I need to be understood. So today we thought we would begin by outlining to you exactly what we did in reasonable detail, and maybe show you some the web pages that were built to complete the project, and then we'll do an overview of the history of it and a few other things. But first, just some ground rules on what we actually did, which we might move to now. The concept was this: that we would take students in a class in the United States and in Australia. We would divide them into firms, law firms, teams in other words. We did that. We ended up with 10 firms, and the mixture of students within those firms was different on each continent. In the US, you only had law students. In Australia, we had to cope with both undergraduate and postgraduate students who were on similar lecture tracks, but different tracks as far as their assessment was concerned. And at Bond, we'd also introduced a new program in electronic commerce, which meant that we had to take information technology students as well. So you had a very broad group to cope with overall. So we broke the entire student body into about 10 teams, firms A through to and including J, which we call law firms. And what we wanted to do was to simulate a real-world law firm experience. So we wanted the students to work across time zones, across legal cultures, on a specific problem that related to privacy law, because that was a hot topic. The students enjoyed it, and we'll talk more about why we chose that as we progress. And the students were then to find a common solution and post that solution in the form of a memorandum of advice on the web. So we might actually just show you now some of the web pages that we built in order to do this, and you'll see that's law firm B from the Australian end. So the students got to see one another. There are lists of email addresses, and the students each had to post at the very beginning of the project a personal privacy statement, which was their understanding of privacy in a digital environment, and basically what they thought privacy should be or could be in this technological age and in the greater context of cyber law. So we got some interesting intros there. Just have a look at that one. Hans-Jon Enger, who I remember was one of my students from Norway. He was 26, studying law for 6 years, graduating December. I think it's important the law protects the individual personal data on the internet. Most countries have laws regulating use, and so on. We got lengthy and sometimes very short statements. And at the very end of the project, we asked students to post how their views had changed as well, and that was interesting, but we'll come back to that. Assigning the law firms was done between the professors, so there was no need to involve the students at that stage. We managed the processes in as detailed a way as we could. The other slide that you can see there now is a law firm member from the US side, Lee Carosi. there were fewer students in the US class than there were in the Australian class. We had about 65, I think it was 25.
Yeah, we had about 18 only in the US, so there's a significant difference in numbers that we had to cope with, as well as the cultural differences and the age differences that Patrick has already mentioned.
The age differences arise because in Australia law is an undergraduate degree, so your students are effectively leaving high school. If they're an undergraduate law student, they'll be studying law and arts, or law and science, or law and accounting, and so they're getting through their degree by the time they're 21, 22, 23, depending on which state they've come from. There are also older students, of course, who join the ranks of law students a little later, but generally there's quite a gap between the students. Postgraduates, of course, tend to be older. So after posting digital photographs, placing personal privacy statements, and assigning, collecting and posting email addresses, we basically let that sit, and the communication that was to take place in order to solve the problem was done by the students, and we'll talk about that in more detail as well. The end of the project then was the submission of a memo of advice, and we've given you an example there. Students for some reason just love to do up their own letterhead and post, pretend that they're in a law firm. And we finished beyond that stage by having a video conference between the two classes. We had to get up very early. The US students had to stay a little late. Somewhat unfortunate timing, which I'll get into as we progress, but that video conference was really designed to discuss what had gone on in the process of deciding what they would write in the memos, and to kind of fine-tune what they'd written. Each student in each firm was able to view the final draft memoranda from each other firm in the set. Okay, we'll just outline quickly what we'll cover today.
Take over now.
Yeah.
Air mouse.
Okay, I'll now become the mouse person. We're going to look quickly at the history and goals of the Joint Privacy Project. JPP stands for Joint Privacy Project 2000. We're going to do it again in September this year with considerable changes. We'll then look at some pedagogical, technological challenges, the student reaction, and then our plans for the next project. So a little bit on history, and from now on Susanna and I will kind of just interpolate our...
Yeah, what we thought would be interesting is just for Patrick to give you the Australian perspective, and then for me to give you the American perspective. Sometimes it's the same, sometimes it's different, just to sort of give you a sense of what it's like to be on both sides of such a project.
Okay, so the idea began when I noticed that Susanna was teaching cyber law at Catholic, with which a university with which I'd had some limited connection a few years back by meeting some faculty members at an ALS conference, and I noticed she was teaching this as I was browsing Jurist, because I teach cyber law, and the way you find out what other people are teaching in cyber law is to go to the Jurist master pages and see what's on offer. And I thought this might be fun to do. I had seen a similar project run. I hadn't seen it run. I'd had it explained to me by a visiting professor who came to us at Bond from the University of Vanderbilt, and they had done this in the management school across 11 countries, and it seemed like a very interesting thing to do. So emails started to flow. Susanna had thought that she had been independently thinking about some kind of a project like this, and that's how we really began.
And what was sort of interesting is that Patrick and I never met each other until after this project was completed. Everything was virtual. All of our dealings with each other was completely virtual. And it certainly is possible to do that. I felt as if I knew Patrick very well before I ever met him face to face. And my first sighting of him was really on a huge screen during the video conference for this project. So this is a truly virtual endeavor, even though Patrick has since come to our law school as a visiting faculty member. But it's kind of an interesting beginning to the project, because we were virtual just as much as the students were virtual.
it was very frightening, not so much to see Susanna for the first time on the screen, because the way we'd set it up was in our largest lecture theatre, and that's a 40 by 40 foot screen, so it was huge. But to see the Dean of Catholic, you know, deans are big in any context, but a 40-foot dean is a really scary thing. So anyhow, just a little on project influences. Teaching e-commerce and teaching cyber law makes you start to think about the globalization of legal practice, and so we wanted something that would do that. And I guess that was certainly a motivating force for us. In terms of our goals, we were really a little bit unclear as to what we wanted to accomplish. And as it progresses today, it'll become clear to you, as it has to us, since the project, that we set our standards way too high. We tried to do far too much, and the teacher evaluations have borne that out in some degree since completing the course. But we're not deterred. We're going to do it again with some modifications, and we have refined our goals somewhat. But our initial goal really was, I wonder, could we do this? I wonder what this would look like, and it was quite a fuzzy goal. We weren't specific enough, I don't think, and we didn't really engage in a lot of the literature we've since found has been written on this thing.
Yeah, I think it was because we both actually have fairly international backgrounds. Both of us have studied in 2 different legal systems, and so we were very attracted to the idea of an international collaborative project, just really because of our backgrounds, I think, and our sense that, at least my sense on the American side, that U.S. students often really do not think beyond the borders of the U.S., yet they are going into a world that is increasingly globalized, and where they will have to deal in many, many, many areas of practice, and increasingly broad areas of practice, with people in other legal systems, and really learn how to talk to people from different cultures, or with limited English skills, or who take very different legal approaches to a similar problem. So we felt that was important, but as Patrick says, our pedagogical goals were probably a bit too fuzzy. It was my first year of teaching, so perhaps everything was a little fuzzy that year. But you do need to plan what kinds of skills you want your students to be learning, and really what you want to achieve. I think you need to give the students a sense of opening and a sense of closure that perhaps we did not do so successfully in this particular project, and we'll explain a little bit later why we think that was the case. But I think that our broad goal is still there very much, and we're still very committed to the idea of exposing students to other students who think very differently. And the feedback, although perhaps somewhat mixed on the project generally, was very strong in that regard. The students liked having that opportunity to think about things from different perspectives, and to really have it presented to them by people who really thought that way, not just me standing up and saying, oh, here's the Australian approach to the problem of privacy protection for personal data on the internet, but have students say that this is their approach to the subject.
In addition, what added more to the mix was the fact that in the Australian class we had students from Norway, Pakistan, India, Malaysia, Australia. I think there was a New Zealander in there. And there was at least one more nationality as well.
There was an American even.
That's right. There was an American. Yeah, exactly. So that added to the mix as well. And I got a little bit of a sense. I haven't told Susanna this before. A little bit of a sense that part of the shock value was for the students at both ends was just looking at this. There's somebody from Pakistan. I've never really met a real Pakistani or a real American, let alone been there, or So that. That added to the excitement value, I think, for the students. But final point on this slide is administrative support. We were both extremely fortunate that our deans were very supportive of us doing this, and we also had extremely good support from our audiovisual people. Greg Stack from Catholic is sitting up the back there, and he knew this was coming, but we really did greatly appreciate the level of expertise that he brought, and Eric Black, for those who are watching the webcast, and David Walker in Australia, who moved mountains for us several times in several different directions when we found that certain technologies weren't going to work.
Absolutely. We could not have done this without Greg's help and extreme good humor and patience throughout the project, as well as Patrick's staff, particularly Eric Black.
That's why there's that kind of Sisyphus-like person up there trying to get that stone up the hill, and it keeps rolling down. Anyhow, the pedagogical challenges then were quite interesting. As I mentioned, the differences in student participants created a problem for us. We've got people with different cultural backgrounds, and you know that can be difficult even when you're in the same classroom, let alone dealing with people across continents. It sort of intensifies a little. We had students of different age groups. We had students who weren't even studying law. And we've only run e-commerce law twice at Bond, and we've got a specialist degree now in e-commerce, and I have really little choice about letting in these students from the IT school. I enjoy having them there actually, because it means that I've got to do some cross-discipline interaction. You make the law students understand and talk to the IT students and vice versa. These, after all, other kinds of people that will be doing IPOs and entrepreneurial projects in 10 years down the track, so they get to learn to talk to these people and understand. And also, in the reverse direction, the IT students see a little bit into the lawyer's world. But we didn't have as much interaction of that kind, I guess, across the continents, because we didn't have to. But we weren't privy to every piece of communication that went on between the students. So
I think the U.S. students were rather shocked at the particularly the diverse ages of the Australian students. They assume that all legal degrees are done as second degrees, whereas in most of the world they're done as first degrees, and you don't have law as a graduate subject much at all, or they're supplementary law degrees. So this really came as an eye-opener, and I think a certain time was spent by the students sort of questioning each other about the training, not an issue that we focused on because we were focusing on one particular area of substantive law that overlapped between our courses. But I do think the students learned a great deal about how one becomes a lawyer in Australia, and certain amounts about the legal profession in Australia, because they could just email each other as much as they wanted, and I did get some feedback from the students about what they were discussing outside of the kind of official listservs for the class.
Yeah, we should probably just interject here and let you know, as far as the communication went, we did try to set up, and we did set up listservs and a whole lot of arrangements for students. But at the end of the day, the bottom line was that the technical telecommunications problems were their problems, not our problems. And we said your baseline is an email address. Now this is what it's going to be like in practice, or that's how we tried to sell it to the students. If there are communications problems between the New York office and the Sydney office of different law firms, you're going to have to solve those problems yourselves when you're in practice, so you might as well get used to it now. We're giving you basic methods of getting in touch with one another. You have to pick it up and take it from there. That backfired slightly in some ways, but they always had the email addresses to fall back on. Some students did go out on their own, and I think some of them, I don't think anyone rang anybody else or organised their own private video conferences, but I think some did get onto chat groups that were entirely outside anything we'd arranged.
And we had a more brutal time difference than many projects that you might want to do in this regard, because 17 hours is really an extremely inconvenient time difference.
Absolutely inconvenient.
This is really throwing the students into the real deep end. But certainly, I think it mirrors practice. It mirrors experiences that I had when I was in practice, working on litigation that was going on in 5 different countries at the same time, where I would have to deal with a lawyer in Uruguay as well as Israel, as well as a number of other countries, and figure out whether I should call them, whether I should email them, how I should get in touch with them, and when I would have to do that. So I think that was a very useful kind of practical thing for the students to learn. They did not necessarily appreciate it at the time, always, but again, after the project was over, they appreciated, that this was something that was really a realistic kind of thing for them to have to think about in this kind of world that we live in now.
It became most pronounced when we did the video conference, because that meant we had to get up at 8 o'clock in the morning, and it was I stupidly suggested that we do that on a Friday morning, and it turned out to be because the Friday morning of the last week of class in Australia, and I mean the Thursday night before they'd been all out partying, and that was a difficult moment for us all, but we got through it.
I think as far as sort of skills training, that really wraps back to the goal, sort of pedagogical goal issue. And one thing that we were really flying in the face of, and I've since read some articles about this. There's an excellent article in the Arizona State Law Journal. The citation, if anybody's interested, is it's by Clifford Zimmerman, and it's called "Thinking Beyond My Own Interpretation." It's in 31 Arizona State Law Journal at 957. And it's just a very good article about collaborative. It's not specifically addressed to international collaborative or to web-based collaborative projects, but it's a good article, I thought, on collaborative pedagogy, collaborative projects in legal education. And I think what Zimmerman says is that you're really flying in the face of sort of traditional legal education, which is effectively competitive in both its evaluation and how the students relate to each other. They are concerned about their class rank, and they're really, in a sense, by the institution, made to be concerned about their class rank. There are ideas of authorship that we foster in law schools. The idea that authorship is completely individual, that your work is your own, your writing is your own, and we don't give them the notion of joint authorship in really the traditional law school course. You take your own exam, you're responsible for it, that's your work, that's what you'll be graded on, and so on. And so the students, I think, coming out of that have a really hard time adjusting to the idea of, okay, now you're expecting us to be collaborative. And so you have to really be aware that by going collaborative, then in a sense, you are challenging a lot of the maybe unspoken assumptions that students get in the course of law school education. However, I'm a firm believer, and I think there are hundreds of studies, it's true that many of them are in the area of primary and secondary education, that say how valuable collaborative learning is to a student's overall learning experience. And looked at from the point of view of education, going all the way back to John Dewey, cognitive psychology like Piaget, Vygotsky. There's tons of literature, and I think over about 90 years there have been at least 600 studies supporting the value of collaborative education, particularly because in the end of the day, law is really a collaborative exercise in many cases. Litigation, which we always think of as just Perry Mason standing up in front of the court, is really a team project. Perry Mason has to be supported by an entire team. And of course, corporate law, it's clearly a team effort. And I think that's something that sadly, students don't realize coming out of a conventional U.S. legal education. But I did sometimes feel like we were fighting that. We were fighting those perceptions, particularly in the area of grading and evaluation. So I would just say that you need to be aware of that. And I do think this Zimmerman article points this out really, really well.
There were a number of students who'd had some experience in a business school at my end, and they didn't have a problem with collaborative work because they do that all the time in the business school. And so that wasn't an issue, but for the law students it was definitely an issue, and some of them were that was the most frustrating aspect for them. They just did not want to have any aspect, any percentage of their mark attributed via a group collaborative.
And we didn't really quite expect that because we had made the percentage very, very small. In my class it was 5% of their grade, which is really not going to affect their overall grade very much if you sort of calculate it out in most cases. However, they were very concerned that it would. I had a few students who felt that it wasn't enough of a percentage of the grade, and they felt that they did more work, and that their efforts were not reflected. So it wasn't uniform at all. But I would probably say about 70% of the students felt that it was too much, 30% felt that it was too little.
Yeah. There was quite a bit of negotiation that had to go on, in fact, between the groups as well. At least at mine, because the groups were bigger, and so there were only one or two max, I think, in the groups at Susanna's end, but at mine they got up to 5 and 6 in some groups, and so people wanted to swap in and out, and they didn't like the other person that was in their group, and all the usual tensions that arose. I only had one really severe meltdown, and fortunately they didn't come to me. I think they kind of dealt with one another, however they dealt with it, and it was presented to me as a kind of fait accompli. This is what we will do. Anyhow, moving on to the problem. Designing the problem was a lot of fun, and something that we're not going to do next time.
Just to interrupt you and say that the problem is in this one handout, sort of buried inside. There are the problems that we use if you want to take a look at what we invented collaboratively.
Well, it was very interesting. We wanted to do privacy. We wanted to have something that would cover 3 jurisdictions: Australia, which has just got a new set of privacy laws; the United States, which has also got new privacy laws, not as comprehensive as ours, but there's been a huge amount of debate in this country; and the European Union, because it's the European Directive on Privacy that's been driving the debate in both the US and Australia. So I said, how about that, in about a 3-line email, and why don't we mix it in with the Olympics and say sell swimsuits, some personal item of apparel. So I sent that off to Susanna, and what came back is what you've got in front of you, this remarkably intricate, extremely a problem full of issues that was extremely interesting to solve. And I sort of grabbed it the first night, and I'm going through thinking, now that raises that and that and that. As it turned out, it was probably a little too substantive for them. We didn't know this at this point, because we thought it was just such a great problem that we'd set. But it could be that they didn't know enough substantive law to engage with it at that point. We're going to alter it next time by using, if you look on the other handout, on the reverse side of that electronic commerce law page, there's a set of discussion questions from chapter 10 of that book, and there are sort of very generic questions about privacy that we hope will generate something a little more manageable.
Yeah, I don't think we focused enough on the broad issues and really exposing students to what the big picture issues were between these jurisdictions and privacy, which is really what we wanted them to come away knowing, that in the European Union directive takes a very protective view, which in the US we don't take, and we're struggling to come to some accommodation right now with Europe on this, and Australia takes a much more also comprehensive view to the problem of privacy. We didn't, although we had classes where we focused on these issues, we slightly threw the students into the deep end, and particularly where Patrick's students were not all law students. That made it difficult, because from the U.S. student perspective, they felt that they had to do a lot more work, which they resented. They felt that they were sort of shoring up the Australian students because they knew more law. Most of my students were third-year law students. And you could still make the exercise really interesting from the third-year American point of view, but also make it more accessible for Patrick's students, I think. And giving them a lot of really detailed problems, you'll still probably give them access to the problems and let them talk about the problems, but we needed to focus much, much more on the broader issues, and that's what we're going to do in the JPP 2001. Because I think we got a little carried away with our own interest in the subject.
We did a little, but we got through it. I think, we've spoken about evaluation and grading. We might just concentrate on some of the technological challenges now a little more. Well, this was a lot of fun. We had 2 websites. That was how we really did it. I'll tell you what we did at mine. I have a web page for my course, and behind a very simple scripted password, I had some pages, and we used passwords because students were concerned about privacy if you're going to put up pictures and email addresses. We put up their digital photographs and the other material that you saw, and that sounds easy enough to do. But when you've got to get 60 people, get an email address, an accurate email address from 60 people, and get them all to access a website using a password, you're talking major difficulties. So that was just at our end. At Susanna's end, we had...
Yeah, I used... I have a separate website for the course, which I just create myself using Microsoft Front Page. But I did create a Lexis web page, which Lexis is now moving over to a different vendor of educational software. And I think that year was the year that they were transitioning over. There were some password problems which they knew about, and they were very helpful in many ways, but they weren't really focusing on completely fixing that software because they were moving over into a new, entirely different software which they felt would solve all the problems. So although I really cannot fault Lexis, I had lots of help from Fran Warren, who's been at this conference, in terms of getting the students' passwords to run. We had some password problems, and the students couldn't get onto the listservs, and that was extremely frustrating. It really meant that the students had to resort to email, although we had these listservs all nicely set up. They couldn't access them. We felt that privacy issues were an important concern for this particular project, and probably many such projects, although you'd have to think about it for yourself. But because the topic of this was privacy and personal data,
it didn't look good.
We just felt, that was something that we could not. Obviously, we polled the students in the beginning, and it was a concern, and from not all the students, but many. So having the two websites was difficult. We're not going to do that again. We're going to use one website.
It's an obvious question. I mean, why did you do it that way? And I'm just thinking now, we were so busy getting it all together that it seemed too much to mail these digital photographs in the hope that that they would get put up. I know that sounds like a tiny thing, but I remember it was all done sort of lockstep. Time was a real problem for us there. So it was easier for me to have complete control over my lot and Susanna to have complete control over hers, and then they would just access each other's sites rather than us folding it all into one site and who would have control of that and so on.
Although it is an issue which we haven't completely resolved what software we're going to use, what course software we will use, because Lexis currently is very US centered and you have to have a Lexis password. Other countries use Lexis, but it's not 100% clear whether their students can get Lexis passwords yet. This is something that I'm sure that Lexis, if they think about it for a minute, will want to encourage this type of project to go on. But right now they're not totally fully set up for it yet. So we're in the process right now of trying to figure out whether Patrick's students can get those passwords. If they can't, then we'll move to some other kind of software. We don't want to create our own listservs because we just don't want to have to deal with that. We would rather use prepackaged listservs. We want to make sure that they're very reliable. Whoever is hosting those listservs, that the servers don't crash, and also that the students can get access to those, because listservs really do make this project pretty easy.
Yeah.
If we do use Lexis, we can also include a live chat feature. They've incorporated it into their new software that didn't have it before. And the students may like that, may not. I think I would push the asynchronous communication over the synchronous communication as probably being preferable, because they can think more about what they're going to write before they say it. But they may like to have that option of just, having some more personal, more real-time engagement with their students. Digital photos for me weren't really a problem. I had one student who was very, very, who was really an engineer, and he took all the photos. They were great quality. So sometimes you're able to delegate certain things to your students. He loved it. He volunteered to do it. He was very pleased about the result and sort of proud of himself for being able to do that. So I could just pass that off to him. Increasingly, I think we're going to get more students who can really help to be our technological assistants in these kind of projects. And, as long as what you ask them to do doesn't detract from their law school studies, I think it's really appropriate. And for him, taking a few digital photos was really not a big deal.
A bit trickier for us because digital cameras are not as widespread yet, or weren't. We had to do it in class time, and then you have to break everybody into groups, and someone from AV has to come in and take the photos, and when you've got 70 people and you've got to get them into the right groups, and one person's missing, so they want to come back and take a second photo, and that gets complicated. Of course, the IT students all had their own digital photograph, which they just emailed me. So that was, you know, they were ready for that. We said again the technical support was fantastic. We should talk about the video conference, I guess. That was actually the easiest thing of all. That was like...
It was easy, but it was initially a bit of a headache, at least from our end. Reason being that we had used ISDN video conferencing in another class, and we were set up to do that. Greg was all set to go on that because he had been doing it for another class. And we used Polycom video conferencing technology, and we had just gotten it installed in the law school. So we were, you know, so when I initially thought of this project, I just assumed that we would be able to do that. Well, in the area of this kind of project, you can't make any assumptions at all because Bond University didn't have anything compatible. They just didn't have ISDN lines. So it wasn't possible for them to use that type of video conferencing technology, and we had to think of something else. So eventually, I thought of just Microsoft NetMeeting, which, you know, is really probably the most basic form of video conferencing technology, simply because I had used it myself before, and that's what we ended up using. Mm-hmm. So this was really a bare bones video conferencing thing. It went very smoothly initially, but we had a lot of fears about, you know, how it would work, whether it would work at all. But once we got some tests going with Patrick's AV support on one end and Greg on the other end, it did go pretty smoothly.
Yeah. The guys at our end did a couple of hacks that made it a little easier for us. Initially, they went off and tried to talk to Boeing and talk them into giving us ISDN access, but that was prohibitively costly. So, as I understand it, I'm not completely au fait with the names of all these things, but they used a camera that takes a lot more frames a second than one of those little normal cameras would, those tiny little webcams. And that meant that whatever was fed through to the US end would be less blotchy than it otherwise might have been. So we had really, really good camera equipment, and then we were at the mercy of the elements, or at the mercy of the packets as the signal went out over the net. But it was 8 o'clock in the morning in Australia, it was 5 o'clock in the afternoon here. I mean, it wasn't the worst time in the world to be doing a live video conference. And when we actually did it, it was just fine.
And actually, that's something that we would do again. We would do more of it, and we would do it much earlier in the course. The video conference we had envisioned as our closure to the course. You know, here's the video conference. We've introduced you by email and by digital photos and personal statements and so on and so forth. I think that we would have been better off to have a video conference right away, because my students were just absolutely blown away by the video conference. They loved it. They were so enthusiastic about it. Even though the quality of Microsoft NetMeeting, it was like watching, I don't know, a Picasso painting, you know, when anyone moved. It was very blotchy. The quality was you know, certainly not like watching video conferencing that you've seen in this conference or that you would see over ISDN lines. It didn't matter. The student, you could hear perfectly, and really all you need to do is, and you could see, as long as people remain stationary, you could see them quite well. And the students just found it thrilling to speak to someone in Australia on a video conference. And they all said to me afterwards, we should have done this right away.
Which is what we will do next time in the course. Technology phobias, I guess that, I mean, we've answered that question in a sense. The longer I'm teaching, the more I realise that the students teach each other how to do that stuff, and you don't really have to worry too much about it. If they really don't know how to use email, well, someone else in their team would have told them how to do it.
There weren't technology phobias, really just problems due to glitches in the technology that were more technology frustrations. They weren't afraid to use a listserv, they were annoyed that we couldn't get them to work.
That's right, yeah. So the student reaction overall, we've probably dealt with this really, that it was a little more mixed than we'd expected. Of course, you know, we wanted glowing reports from everybody about every aspect of it, and that didn't happen. Some students really, really enjoyed it and found it excellent and loved the working together for the memos and so on. You could put some of that down probably to the basic human factors of who got into which group, and were they interested, keen, bright students, or were they just
And we assigned, at least I assigned them to the groups, and the reason for that is I just didn't want everybody, sort of glomming onto their existing friends. I wanted them to work with people who might be different, and I had to choose who was going to have to bear the burden of being the only American student in a group, where most of the time we were able to have 2 American students. So those students might have to do more, and I didn't want the students to somehow feel they had to volunteer for that kind of thing. I just wanted it to sort of be completely random, and I told the students it was random. I was drawing their names out of a hat, and that's how I did it. And I had no complaints about who was assigned to what group.
Yeah, I had a couple of sinking moments where a very frustrated young lady came up to me and said, "You can't possibly put me in that group." And we fixed it. It was more trouble than it was worth, so we just moved that to one side. But everything else was pretty much the same way. In terms of redesigning for next time, we hope to be a little clearer with the students about what we want them to get out of it. In terms certainly of the broader theoretical aims that we have in terms of globalization, but also very specifically, what you will do. It will be done in this order, and this is what will. We set that out, but last time, it was probably more complex than it needed to be. So clearer and simpler is probably what we.
And I think, the funny thing is that you think that you're actually being more simple than you could otherwise be. So just as if when you're trying to pack for a trip, you should pack your suitcase and then remove half of it and put it in the closet and only take half of what you think you'll need. Really, we should have taken that approach to this, pared it down even more, because there are so many new things that are going on for the students in this kind of project that you really don't want to overload them, given that they had to do things. This was not the entire course, and they were responsible for lots of other things in the course that, where my course was completely unrelated to what Patrick was teaching different subject matter, and so on and so forth. So you can't forget that this is only, to the students, this is only one thing out of many that you're asking them to do if you do a course in this way.
In terms of changing the method of assessment, certainly there'll be no percentage for my students next time. There'll be no percentage of the course grade put in for this project, but there will be a kicker, which is unless you post a certain minimum number of posts in the listserv, you're going to fail the 20% class participation component. And in addition, we mark students on tube participation for every single tutorial, which is quite a burden, but they will need that. This will be taken into account as part of that, and it also means that they'll have to be there for the video sessions that we're going to have.
Because that's really the perennial problem with these kinds of projects. If you want the students to interact, how do you motivate them to interact when they're so burdened by so many other things? My students were third-year students. They have to do all kinds of externships, writing requirements. They're doing a million things. They're worrying about their future. And the problem is that they can easily be overloaded. If you have no grade, then it's very easy for them to say, "Oh, forget it. I don't need to do this," or "I'd like to. It's interesting, but I really don't have time." So I do think you need some kind of stick as well as the carrot of it being interesting. Yeah. But again, I think you have to be really careful, because to encourage them to be truly collaborative, you also don't want them to try and be too competitive with each other at the same time.
So next time we'll have more video conferencing from the very beginning. We'll work in some live chat, although I think the most useful will still probably be the listservs. The technological glitches, we mentioned that we're trying to iron those out, and better closure for the students would involve revisiting what they'd done. In a sense, it ended a little abruptly, certainly at my end, following the video conference, in part because they sort of ran off to their exams and to their all the other assessment that was pressing and competing against this.
Right, because that's something to think about. In most of these collaborative projects, you will not have the same academic schedule that the other institution has. I mean, Patrick's and mine were fairly close,
Pretty good.
but not identical. And of course, given that he's in the southern hemisphere, it's really a different semester. Mine was in the fall semester, and that's the equivalent of the spring semester for him. So the students may be in a slightly different mental state in their spring semester than they are in the fall semester. And in many parts of the world, you'll have a completely different academic year, and you have to go with that because there are certain things that happen, like exams, that are going to interfere. Even if the actual exam isn't taking place, if a student is worried about having to take an exam in the next week, it's going to be pretty hard to get them to really fully participate in the project. So you do have to think really carefully about scheduling, and not just when do our courses overlap, but what's the next thing that they're going to be required to do in the course, and how is that going to work.
And then they change things yet again, because this time I've got to run e-commerce as an intensive, so that'll be 6 or 7 days over a 9-week period, and not a regular class meeting. So, but we've coped with that simply by just rearranging the timetable again. It's not going to affect us, but it's still to consider.
Yeah, we can open up the floor to any questions that you might have, because I think that sort of spells out, what we were trying to do, what we did, and how we would do it differently. We're still excited about the project, and we're certainly not abandoning it. We feel we're just refining it, because in many ways we do feel that it was a wonderful experience for the students as well as for us to have. Yes?
The students had trouble finding the applicable law since you're doing, cross-jurisdictional sorts of things?
Well, in our classes, to some extent, we do teach across jurisdictional boundaries on these issues. So we tried to prep the students to some extent to be able to do that. Also, our classes are on cyber law, and part of the classes is to require the students to look for materials that are online. And these privacy materials are very much available online.
Well, I wondered because you had somebody in Germany there.
Yeah, we had both required them to learn the European law, and we tried to. I had a couple of classes where I tried to go over certain issues. So, for example, we were just requiring them to learn so-called generic European Union law on privacy. It doesn't really exist. We were trying to steer them away from trying to go into too much detail in other legal systems beyond Australia and the U.S.
So I can see my students obsessing and
The feeling was with the cross-jurisdiction as well, that the Australians would advise on Australian law, the Americans would advise on American law. That old rule, you only ever advise on the law in which you're admitted, in the jurisdiction in which you're admitted. I think with one group I specifically stopped them from going into German law, and I said you don't have to do that. The groups that had the Norwegians in them were very fortunate, and they realised that was a bonus later because they knew all the European law and they could slot it in.
And we told them not to worry about issues like jurisdiction. They just would sort of assume that jurisdiction existed, or they could make assumptions, because we tried to just direct them towards the issues that we wanted them to focus on. There were lots of issues that were raised in these problems that they could have gone down the other path, and so we tried to narrow them. And we had some dialogue with them. They could ask us questions about what issues should they be focusing on. But I think, like I say, next time we're going to try and do this in a little less detail, so that they don't obsess too much. We didn't really find that that was a problem. They didn't appear to be. I think some of them were intimidated about writing the memo, but they weren't really too intimidated about the cross-jurisdictional issues because they were working with other students who could be resources for them on those issues.
And it was nice to find US students sort of giving opinions on Australian law and Australians on American. Suddenly this whole vista was open to them. They really do. They have laws in America. Gosh. It's like that. It's this kind of
or these problems exist somewhere else in the world too.
Yeah.
Was the video conference part of the simulation? Were they doing it like lawyers conferring with each other, or was it just a closure to it where they got to see each other?
It was a closure where we discussed, the issues, because we only had one video conference. But next time we would ideally like to have the ability for the students to meet in their groups and have an earlier video conference. The problem was we were having so many technological issues that we just were not in a position to hold earlier video conferences. But next year we will be, and using Microsoft NetMeeting is pretty easy. So we would like to set up some other video conferences where students in each group could meet virtually through a video conference, and that would be much more pedagogically effective.
Okay.
Any other questions, comments, feedback for JPP 2001?
Thank you.
Thank you
Yeah.
very
Was it more of a benefit or a liability with the really broad age range and background of the Australian students?
I think you can view it as a glass half empty, glass half full thing. It's really kind of your attitude toward it. It's a reality. The students, were not necessarily 100% comfortable with it, with the idea, oh, here are these IT students, I have to deal with them, they don't know any law. But the reality is that oftentimes in the real world, you're not going to be dealing with people who are very much like you. There are probably some maturity issues, I think, that existed.
Yeah, that can be an issue, and you really, I've met, some students who are 19 going on 37, going on 106.
And the reverse.
And
I'm not saying the maturity issues were only on the Australian side. Its age does not necessarily correspond, to maturity.
I like a class where you've got groups like that because it improves your the elders explain to the young ones, and vice versa. With technology stuff, the younger ones help the older ones.
What surprised the U.S. students the most was the international nature of Patrick's class. They thought they were all going to be Australians. They were amazed that they were from Norway, Pakistan, India, Malaysia, you name it. And I think that proved to be excellent because there really were many more cultural differences once you included all these other countries. We had one international student from South Africa who was not a lawyer, also who was studying in our Communications Law Institute, and so we had one student who took in the U.S. who wasn't studying for a degree, who took a different approach to the problems, but she was a similar age to the U.S. students.
Great.
Well, thank you very
Thank you very much for staying, and have a safe trip home.